The Middle East almost literally blew up over the last week. This has to do with Donald Trump naming Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. He's talking about how he was going to be moving the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And because of this, there were riots all over the Middle East, and all over Israel and Palestine. It was ridiculous. There was fighting in East Jerusalem. And just in different cities around Jerusalem, around Israel. There was just riots breaking out, and it got violent. Tear gas was thrown. There was a few people ended up getting killed. Now, before we go any farther in the story, I think it's really dumb. I think it's really stupid that anybody thinks they can lay claim to a land simply because of an ancient religious book. If that you think that gives you the right, then I gotta say that is fucking stupid in my opinion. Because there's nothing, just because it's an ancient book, there's nothing in there that dictates that that means rightful ownership. And if that's the case, then why are we not talking about the poor people of Canaan? And the people of the Canaanites, were the ones that the Israelites slaughtered to take over the Holy Lands. There were, I believe, 3 different kingdoms. I can't remember the names of all of them, but I do know that one was the kingdom of Canaan. And in fact, God helped the Israelites destroy Canaan. Because at one point there was a battle, and Joshua, who was leading after Moses died, after he led them into the desert, they were there for 40 years apparently, and then they came out, and that was led by Joshua because Moses had passed by that point. Well, military historians first off believe that they weren't just chilling out in the desert for 40 years they wandered the desert for 40 years, but they were training an army that could go back and fight the war and take the land that was promised to them. So Joshua led them in, fought several different battles. I believe Joshua was the one who fought at the Battle of Jericho. But anyway, in one battle against the Canaanites, Joshua decided he was going to ambush the Canaanites. That's what he was going to do. So he marches forward about 1,000 of his Israelite soldiers to take to the battlefield. And then the Canaanites see that it's such a small army, and it encourages them to go forward, to fight on. Because they've been hearing all these stories up to this point about the Israelites, the unstoppable, invincible force of the Israelites. So when they show up, there's like 1,000 of them. They're easily outnumbered. They're saying, well, we can take them. Let's go. So what ends up happening is, as they descend on these 1,000 Canaanites, Joshua leads a counterattack from some bushes and some trees that were there. Most of his army is hiding there. They attack and they flank the enemy, the Canaanites, and they destroy them, take over the Holy Land. However, in this moment, Joshua asked God to hold the sun in its position. And because of this reason, it blinded the Canaanites from the Israeli advance. So that way the Canaanites wouldn't know they were there until they were descending right on top. Until they were like right on top of the Canaanites. So apparently in this story, God was more than willing to listen to Joshua and allow him to slaughter the Canaanites. So why are we not talking about them? Because they had original claim over the Holy Land. So what happened? They were there first. They may not have been technically the promised land to them, but they were there first. Isn't that the way we're playing this? And then Jerusalem itself has just been significant in all 3 of the Abrahamic religions for different reasons. The Israelites, the promised land, that would make sense. For the Christians, it was where Jesus ascended to heaven, where he taught and where he ascended to heaven. For the Muslims, it has to do with where Muhammad preached at. He preached at Jerusalem. That's why Jerusalem is the 3rd most holy site in Islam. But now Donald Trump goes and is the one who says that he's willing to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And everywhere blows up. Al-Qaeda claimed a holy war against Trump because of this. The Middle East, the Palestinians, were all burning pictures of Netanyahu and Donald Trump, Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister. And yeah, there was just a lot of riots throughout the rest of the day. And it even got so bad that rockets began firing in from Gaza over Israel. And Israel managed to use Israel has good air defense guns, so they managed to shoot down most of them. However, one did land in a neighborhood. Thankfully, nobody was hurt. But then in retaliation the next day, which I believe was just this past Friday, I believe, Israel retaliated with an airstrike that ended up killing 2 of Hamas's soldiers and injured 25 more. It's unclear right now, I think. Maybe by now, I haven't seen it recently. But as far as I know, it's unclear whether those 25 injured are civilians or part of Hamas's military organization. But Gaza fired the rockets first after this went down into Israel. This was exactly the sort of thing that led to the 2014 war between Israel and Gaza. I think it was the 72-day war, if I remember correctly. It was the fact that Gaza kept firing missiles and rockets into Israel. There was like a week where this went by, and Israel then said, fuck it, we're going in. And then a lot of people condemned Israel for going into Gaza over this. But what the hell are they supposed to do when there's just missiles and rockets falling down like rain over their population? And the difference is Israel, from what I can tell, tries to use as much precision as possible. They go after military targets. For instance, this past Friday or Saturday, I can't remember which day it was, where they made their strike against Gaza, their airstrike, they hit a weapons depot. They didn't just go after civilians. They went and hit a weapons depot. The difference is that when Hamas started firing rockets into Israel, they weren't going after a military target or a political one. They went after civilians. They were firing these rockets down on neighborhoods with the explicit intention of killing Israeli civilians. That's the big difference between the two. During the 72-day war, Israel ended up, I think there was 2,500 Palestinian civilians killed during this time. Everyone criticized Israel over that. Nobody talked about the fact that Israel was sending out mass texts and phone calls to civilians in Gaza, telling them that they were going to be making airstrikes against them and attacks against them within the next few minutes and to get themselves out. Nobody talked about this. There was video evidence of missile batteries and artillery guns being set up in heavy civilian populated neighborhoods. And they were just firing off right from there. Hamas literally used their civilians as human shields. That's what they were doing because they knew that if they used them as human shields and Israel was suddenly killing off a bunch of civilians, then the world was going to turn on them. That the view of the world is going to say, well, look at these people killing civilians. When in fact, it was Hamas deliberately putting them in that position. And Israel's not perfect. Israel fucks up all the time. There was recently, within the last month or two, an article about an Israeli soldier that was sentenced to prison time for the murder of a Palestinian man. In this situation, a Palestinian man had tried to commit a knife attack, and he ended up getting shot and wounded in the process and dropped the knife, and he was down on the ground. The Israeli soldier approached him and then shot him again while he was on the ground with no knife. When people presented this, the first person I heard to present this was Abby Martin, who used to be for Russia Today. She was on the Joe Rogan podcast, pulled up the video, was talking about it, and she's very critical of Israel about what they do. And she talked about that, about how it was pure murder and sanctioned by the government, blah, blah, blah. Well, not only did the guy get arrested and charged over this, it was seen as unacceptable by the population, by the government, to the point where they actually sentenced him to prison. The other thing is what I had to find out on my own that she didn't mention was the fact that the guy was trying to do a knife attack. I thought this was a civilian Palestinian that this happened to, not doing anything, minding his own business, and then gets gunned down by an Israeli soldier. No, turned out he was trying to do a knife That doesn't excuse the fact that the Israeli soldier murdered him, but that's a key point of a key piece of information you might want to put in. Just recently, there within these riots going on, there have been a few people that were killed, but there was one report that came out where an Israeli soldier shot and killed a Palestinian man who turned out not to have a knife or anything like that. So Israel fucks up, don't get me wrong. But everybody, I find, picks and chooses, and essentially they cherry pick these stories and say, look at what happened here, but they don't give much context as to what was going on beforehand. Personally, I haven't heard too much about what's really gone down in Palestine and Israel. People kind of spoke about it for the first couple days, then they just talked about like shitting on Trump for doing it and how all of Trump's allies are against this decision. But nobody's really talking about a lot of the attacks that are going on in Israel right now. In fact, it was the Israel Times where I'm getting most of this information. I'm not even getting it from Western news sources. This isn't CBC, this isn't CTV, this isn't MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, or any of those other ones. This is Israel Times. It was completely coincidental because when I was on there, I accidentally, they say, do you want to allow them access to information? And I accidentally clicked yes instead of no. So they start sending me, all new articles and stuff and updates, and that's where I've been getting most of my information. It's actually been quite helpful. But if you actually pay attention to what's going on, Israel is always having knife attacks. They're always having bus bombs and this and that and the other going on against them. And I mean, people talk about the illegal occupation of Palestine, the West Bank. People talk about this occupation, but they don't really talk about the history that went in to how this happened. They just say that Israel is in occupied territories. They are an occupying force. Nobody really talks about how in the war where Israel ended up taking the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which they have returned since then to the Palestinians back in 2006, which since then they've just loaded it up on fucking rockets and missiles and shit. They haven't really built themselves up into anything. But during that time, 3 nations were prepared to go in and destroy Israel. Back in, I think it was 1966 when the war happened. It was Egypt, Jordan, and was it possibly Syria? They were planning to move in and destroy Israel. 3 armies were amassing on Israel's border, and Israel decided to say, fuck it, we're going in, we're doing a preemptive strike. In their preemptive strike that they made against Egypt, they managed to take out most of Egypt's air force, which actually bought them an advantage because Israel had a strong air force even in that time. So they were managed to destroy I think it was the air base that was just along their border, which gave them a significant advantage. And then when this happened, that's when Israel said, fuck it, we're going in. They attacked Palestine and Jordan, and this is when the West Bank ended up falling in Israel's control. When all the dust settled on the war, Israel retained control of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So the difference is Israel did take that land. Don't get me wrong, Israel did not originally own the West Bank nor Gaza. They went in with force and took it. But that was just when they seemed to be on the point of genocide. 3 armies that hated Israel. And with the history that the Muslims have with the Jews, I'm sure Israel did not feel super confident in their chances of, just being a subjugated force. They were probably worried of being completely wiped off the map. So they went in and they made their attacks. One thing about taking land is it was a show of force. You took someone's land because it showed that you were bigger and stronger, and it was also sort of a fuck you to all your enemies around you, telling you, don't you come at me, this is going to happen to you too. So that's what I think Israel did. So I'm not going to I know I seem very defensive of Israel. Israel has fucked up, and Israel has done plenty of bad shit. But I find everybody tends to ignore what is actually thrown back at Israel. the shit that they've got to deal with, the fact that their people have to, every single one of their citizens has to do mandatory military service. They do this because they're in such a dangerous situation, not because it's cool, yo. I honestly feel that when Israel returned Gaza to the Palestinians, Gaza was a much smaller piece of land than the West Bank. I truly believe that this was Israel's sort of experiment. They say, what would happen if we gave up this land and we returned Israel, gave up the West Bank and Gaza? So I think what ended up happening is they gave it up because there's been a lot of international pressure on them to do this, to get out of these occupied territories, as everyone else classifies it. I think when they removed it out of Gaza, it was a test to see how things would go. And since then, they've just seen how essentially Gaza built up themselves along the border and prepared to strike Israel at every single opportunity. So now, if they pull out of the West Bank, what is most likely going to happen? What is most likely going to happen? Probably the same thing. And we also cannot, when we are discussing what's going on in Israel and Palestine in the Middle East, we cannot go without mentioning what I believe this one may have actually been the Hezbollah's 3 no's. But essentially, the 3 no's were either Hamas or Hezbollah's rules when dealing with Israel. Those 3 no's were no recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel, and no negotiation with Israel. While Hamas and Hezbollah may have lightened up their stances against Israel in recent days, they're still extremely harsh. For their policy against Israel is still extremely harsh, to the point where it's not exactly an incentive for Israel to give up the Western Bank. Whenever this report came out that Hezbollah was going to be lightening their stance on Israel, people treated it as if it was like, we're seeing new ground being made. It sounded a little, wow, maybe we're seeing the start of peace negotiations or something. Yeah, it turned out they pretty much said, okay, well, maybe we won't destroy Israel. That was pretty much their change. It's like, yeah, we still feel the same way about them. We hate them and everything. We want to fight them, but maybe we won't wipe them off the face of the earth. Oh, how generous of you to not commit genocide. Was that hard for you? I'm so sorry. The other thing is growing up, I never had much of an opinion on the Palestinian-Israel situation until, again, I started getting more and more interested in politics when I got older. One thing that, though, as I have sort of taken a more solid position on what goes on in Israel and Palestine, and I found myself more on Israel's side, one of the reasons for this was actually in a podcast, one of Sam Harris's podcasts, one of his early ones back in the day, a few years ago. I think during this time, it was during the 2014 war. And so I believe he was asked the question is, why does he support Israel? He says, he's like, well, think about it this way. He says, if tomorrow the Palestinians decided that they were going to lay down their arms and they're not going to fight anymore, what would happen? Probably nothing. Probably just life, sort of like how things are going now in Israel and Palestine would probably be what happened if that was the decision. On the other side, what would happen if Israel lay down their arms tomorrow and said, we're not going to fight anymore? Israel would probably be wiped off the map within 24 hours. And I actually agree with that. And I think that's a realistic time frame, that if Israel said they weren't fighting, I think 24 hours is a realistic time frame, because Israel's not very big. It really isn't. If you take out the West Bank and everything, when Israel's original size, when it was founded, it was only about 6 miles thick. Like, you could only go across 6 miles from the Gulf, and then you'd be entering Palestine. So it's not very big. So 24 hours seems like a very realistic possibility. And I do think that's what would happen. With the foreign policies that others have towards Israel, especially all the surrounding nations of Israel, what their foreign policy is towards the Israelites, or not the Israelites, the Israelis, they're not the Israelites. I I really can't help but feel that's exactly what would happen. So between everything, I find myself leaning to more in support of Israel, just in general, for that very reason. However, what Trump said was fucking dumb, and why I've said before that he is terrible on the international stage. We knew this is what was going to be the result. We knew that if they said that Jerusalem was the capital of Israel, the capital of the only Jewish country in the world, surrounded by Muslim countries, then we knew the Muslims would be pissed, and we knew they would revolt. You know, it's a little while ago, I was taking a cab home. Can't really remember where I was now, but I was talking to the cabbie, and he was a Muslim, and he ended up talking. Essentially, he went off about Donald Trump and about, like, just the way... Essentially, he said, like, Donald Trump and them are the evil ones. Zionists really hate Jews. Islam is a religion of peace. Blah, 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 blah. And, that was weird about the Zionist part, too. He said, Zionists are not Jews. In fact, Zionists hate Jews. I was like, okay... Every single president who has been in power has been a Protestant. Not exactly true. I looked that part up. But he went on and on about this. But ever since I've had that conversation with the cab driver, I've seen more and more shit like this. I'm like, you want me to believe that Islam is a religion of peace, yet I keep hearing attacks that are coming and things like this where there are riots going around because Jerusalem is now the capital of Israel. So just recently with the riots that happened, it brought me back to that conversation with the dude, and I was just thinking, man, would his opinion be different now if what has happened over the last month or so since I've had that conversation with him, if he'd still come back to me and say, you still stand by your opinion, bud? I get the feeling he would, although I'd just drives me insane watching this, especially because it's completely a religious argument. Both claims on both sides are being made strictly under a historical religious basis. That's it, which is not a good enough excuse for me, not a good enough reason for me to give land to one side or the other. But if we are playing by those rules, then the Jews win. Because their religion goes back to about 1800 BC, roughly. Christians don't come in until about 2,000 years ago. And then Islam doesn't come in until about 600, 700 AD. So there is like almost a 2,000-year difference between the two religions. So in this claim, if we are playing by the rules of ancient religious books, then Israel wins. And Jerusalem is the rightful city of the Jews, not the Muslims. So probably not a very popular opinion, and I wonder if I'm going to get any shit for this podcast for saying stuff like this. This will be interesting. But I want to thank you for joining me on the podcast today. I'm Adrian Lloyd. This is just my stupid opinion, and I'll see you all soon.